Yet? Yes. Um, this is David Barsamian in the backseat of a car driving from Santa Fe to Albuquerque on a beautiful morning in New Mexico. And I'm very pleased to be talking with Howard Zinn, Professor Emeritus at Boston University, noted author whose People's History of the United States continues to sell in huge numbers. I understand it's now past 1 million copies.
Well, yes, I must admit it's past 1 million
Do you
copies.
buy all the copies?
I only buy half of them, but my family buys the rest.
That explains that. I want to talk to you about something that Studs Terkel has been talking about around the country. He says we in the United States have a national Alzheimer's disease. We forget history. What do you think about that as a historian?
Studs Terkel has a nice way of putting things, and he's right. Yeah, we have a way of forgetting. Well, we could put it another way, that our culture likes us to forget things, or the people in charge of our culture and the people in charge of the media and the people in charge of our educational system would like us to forget certain things. Certainly the political leaders would like us to forget. And the result is, if the media and the cultural system and the political leaders all collaborate in trying to make us forget, then we have a national case of Alzheimer's. And we couldn't have a better instance of it than when a war is pending. And it seems that in the history of the United States, since the end of World War II, a war is almost always either on or pending. And when you're in a war situation or a near-war situation, that is exactly the time when the government would like the citizenry to forget history. Because if the citizenry remembered history and then they listened to the leaders of the government get up before the microphones and say, well, it seems we need to go to war for this reason or that reason. We need to go to war to liberate South Korea. We need to go to war to liberate South Vietnam or all of Vietnam, or we need to go to war to end the drug problem in Panama. We need to go to war because Grenada is an enormous threat to the security of the United States. Or we need to go to war because Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and so on. Well, people knew some history, and they went back over all of those claims that the government made about why we need to go to war, and they would know by this time that those claims were largely erroneous. Well, then the people would be very skeptical if the government came to it at this point and said we need to go to war on Iraq because Saddam Hussein is a tyrant, or because Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, or because we are just a gentle giant in the world, and everything we do with our giantism is designed for the betterment of humanity. Well, if people knew history, they would scoff at that. They would laugh at that. They would get angry at that, and they would feel that the wealth and the younger generation of our country are about to be expended on the basis of a lie.
Rosa Parks is a very interesting figure in American history, and the conventional story about her is that she had a hard day at the office one day and had very tired feet and decided not to sit in the back of the bus. But in fact, the real Rosa Parks was someone quite different from that story.
Well, you seem to know a lot about Rosa Parks, David. But it's true that the conventional story is a nice, pleasant story, and of course I think the real story is an even more pleasant story. That is, the real story is not that she was an innocent who suddenly got tired, but she was an activist. She was a member of the NAACP. She had long been active against racial segregation in Montgomery, Alabama. She had gone to the Highlander Folk School, which is a kind of place that the establishment didn't like. Not only the southern establishment, but the northern establishment didn't like. It was a kind of oasis of interracial camaraderie in Tennessee, where people in the labor movement got together and people in the sort of nascent civil rights movement got together for conferences and workshops. So Martin Luther King was there, Andy Young was there, but the Highlander Folk School was looked upon as a kind of outside the pale of respectability. It was too far to the left. And in fact, when Martin Luther King went there, photographs were displayed in KKK and right-wing newspapers showing King there and saying King had attended a communist establishment. Well, Rosa Parks went to the Highlander School also. In other words, Rosa Parks was a politically sophisticated and quite progressive person who got involved in the Montgomery bus situation quite deliberately and not by accident. And I think that story is intended to be buried because when progress does take place, when remarkable events take place like the Montgomery bus boycott, the establishment doesn't want people to know that it comes as a result of long, persistent organization, patience, education, because that would suggest to the American people that that's the way change comes about, not by accident, but by deliberate organization.
And Rosa Parks was trained in the philosophy of nonviolence and the techniques of civil disobedience at the Highlander Center. So, I mean, if I could interject something, it seems to me that the idea of an ideologically driven African American woman is very threatening to the conventional story of history.
Well, yes, on a number of accounts, that is the as you say, ideologically driven. That is driven by ideas, driven by philosophy, driven by a point of view, and no, they don't want to suggest that the important actors in history have that kind of background. And certainly a black person, certainly a woman, yes, on 3 counts, it goes against the orthodoxy of the establishment.
And let's talk a little bit about another figure in American history who has kind of been compartmentalized, and that's Martin Luther King Jr. Every January 15th, on the occasion of his birthday, all the media constantly play his wonderful speech, I Have a Dream, given on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in August of 1963. But there was another Martin Luther King that evolved in the last 5 years of his life, and particularly the one that gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York on April 4th, 1967, called Breaking the Silence. That's a radical Martin Luther King that we don't hear much about.
No, that's absolutely true.
Are you agreeing with everything I say?
I'm waiting for you to say something that I disagree with. And you'd better come up with something like that, or, what will people think? They'll think that here you and I are trapped in the back of this car, and we'd better agree with one another, or mayhem will ensue. So, but, sometimes you're right, David, okay? Let's put it that way.
The law of averages.
Yeah. And King is sanitized and made to appear a sort of nice man who had a dream. But what they will never say, King had a dream about socialism. I mean, that would shock people if you said King had a dream about socialism. But in fact, King, when he was talking to his staff in the 66, 67, early 68, not long before he was killed, talked about the failure of the American economic system, the failure of capitalism, the connection between capitalism and militarism, and said we need a kind of socialism. We need a kind of democratic socialism. That was, of course, a dream that is not going to be recorded by the major media. And that is even forgotten by a lot of people who want to go beyond the major media. And King was quite radical in a number of ways. As you pointed out in that speech that he made to the Riverside Church in 1967 was a speech which, for the first time publicly, he'd been talking about it privately, but this is the first time publicly he had denounced the United States government for its war in Vietnam, and said, in fact, that, and I mean, this is just a paraphrase, but said, the United States was really the most dangerous and violent country in the world.
Yeah, the exact quote was, "The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today."
I thought that if I paraphrased, you would come up with the exact quote, David. And from now on, I'm going to come up with the exact quote, and I'd like you to paraphrase. I mean, that seems only proper. And it was not easy for him to make that speech. That is not easy in the sense that other major civil rights leaders, and he was constantly in the position of having to deal with the other major civil rights leaders, with Whitney Young of the Urban League, with Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, and these other leaders of the civil rights movement thought that the leaders of the black movement should not speak out on Vietnam because it would hurt their cause, because they would lose whatever capital they had built up with the establishment. But King was a person of principle and courage, and he felt strongly about what we were doing in Vietnam, and he was determined to speak out. And he understood that militarism in the United States was tied up with the economic system, that it was built into American history, and he was a pacifist. He was opposed to war, and in a very deep way. So he was willing to break with the civil rights establishment and make this speech, which was, I think, a very important speech in telling black people in this country that, yes, their kind of natural feelings of resentment against the United States could come out, that they didn't have to prove themselves, as very often black people have thought they had to do, prove themselves to be super patriots like other Americans, that they could come out and denounce American foreign policy. And I would put Martin Luther King's speech alongside Muhammad Ali's protest against the war, which cost him the title of heavyweight champion, but which was one of the, I think, heroic acts of the Vietnam period. But I want to say something else about Martin Luther King and his radicalism, which I think grew. That is, I think it was there fundamentally with him as a young man, as he studied Gandhi, and he understood that there was something wrong with the American economic system. But I think his ideas on that crystallized more and more as the years went on. And by 1967, 68, he was talking in the way that I just mentioned to his staff, and he had decided that now that certain gains had been won in the civil rights struggle, the Voting Rights Act had been passed, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the movement really did not know which way to turn at this point. And he saw that the way to turn was to deal with economic injustice, deal with the poverty of the black people, which he knew would persist despite the civil rights laws, that was the fundamental problem. And that's why he planned for early 1968, just before his assassination, he planned for the Poor People's March on Washington. And that whole record of Martin Luther King, you might say, has been kept in darkness by the establishment, and it certainly should be brought forth.
It's almost like he's frozen on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in giving that very poetic speech. But another thing about King was what he was doing in Memphis when he was assassinated. Exactly a year to the day he gave that Riverside Church speech, he was organizing striking sanitation workers, and people don't know about that.
That's right. That was a remarkable moment, the strike of the sanitation workers in Memphis, which King supported. And you're right, people know he was assassinated, but they have no idea what he was doing in Memphis. Why was he there? He was there to support these strikers. And I wonder how many of the teachers in this country who teach about Martin Luther King, and of course everybody teaches about Martin Luther King, but I wonder how many of the teachers about Martin Luther King themselves know why he was in Memphis, or know about King, the kinds of things that we were just talking about.
It seems these are the kinds of things, uncovering these nuggets, as it were, of American history that you've been so keen to develop and report on.
I must agree with you there, David. Anytime you praise what I've done as a historian, I feel that somehow you must be right. I'm not the only one, of course.
Yeah.
I think maybe there's one other person in the country. No, there's really a new generation of young historians, and there's a new generation of teachers. And I'm not claiming they're a majority at all, but certainly they're a substantial minority in the teaching profession, because I keep running into them all over the country. There's a new generation of teachers who are trying to teach history in a new way, and this is encouraging. And I speak a lot of time to teachers around the country, and I'm always encouraged by whatever town I'm in. I'm always running into teachers who are trying to teach a new kind of history to their students.
You tell the very moving and inspiring story of the first time you go to Southwest Georgia, sometime around 1960, and you say you thought you were almost moving back into the age of slavery, but underneath those appearances, there was something remarkable going on in terms of organizing. Could you tell that story?
Oh, I suppose you're talking about Albany, Georgia, in 1960-61, and of course the sit-ins had taken place. The first sit-ins had taken place in February 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. And then, of course, a wave of sit-ins throughout the South in the spring of 1960. And March of 1960, it spread to Atlanta, Georgia, where I was teaching at Spelman College. And so, yes, things were happening. But there were parts of the South that were still silent, that the movement had not yet reached. And one of these was Albany, Georgia. As you pointed out, a part of the South that felt as if slavery was still there. That was the atmosphere I felt as I went into Albany in December of 1960. I went there because there had been suddenly, surprisingly, an uprising of the black population of Albany, Georgia. I say suddenly, surprisingly. That is suddenly surprisingly to outside observers, but not surprisingly to people who lived in Albany and who knew that under the surface of silence, under the surface of obedience to the norms of segregation, the black population of Albany was seething with anger against their humiliation, their daily humiliation. And it broke out in December of 1960 with demonstrations and sit-ins and people, a young woman, a kid, really, a 16-year-old kid refusing to sit in the back of the bus, and being arrested. And I remember her name, Ollie Mae Quarterman, a remarkable young person. And the bus driver ordered her to get in the back, and she said, I paid my damn nickel and I'll sit where I please. And thousands of people in Albany, Georgia were arrested. You might say a good portion of the black population of Albany, Georgia. And at that point, the Southern Regional Council, which was a research organization in Atlanta, asked me if I would go down to Albany to really make a report on the situation there, on all of these thousands of people who were in jail. And I was happy to go for a number of reasons. One, I was by that time on the executive board of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and SNCC had in fact sent a couple of organizers down who were involved in the organization of these demonstrations in Albany. And also several students of mine had gone down to join the movement in Albany and were arrested and were in jail at the time. So you might say, as a teacher, I felt it my duty to go down and see if I could visit my students in jail. Well, I'm romanticizing that a little. I doubted that they would let me visit my students in jail, and in fact they didn't. But I did go down and yes, and discovered there'd been a good deal of organization by the NAACP, by SNCC in Albany, Georgia, which resulted in this eruption in December of 1960. And what I came up with in the first report I made, and then another report I made in the spring, taking a look at all of the incidents in Albany, all of the arrests, the beatings, the kinds of things that took place thousands of times in the South during this period of racial segregation, and looking for the key to all of this that was going on, it struck me that the key to it was not Southern racism, but the key to it was the compliance of the national government with Southern racism, the collaboration of the White House and of the Justice Department with racial segregation in the South. And this was a common perception among liberals and among in the nation generally. And the common perception was the South is racist, the North is different. There's racial segregation in the South, but the national government is on the side of the Negro. Of course, this wasn't true at all. And this was so evident in Albany, Georgia, where the Constitution was being violated again and again by Southern law enforcement officers, sheriffs, and police, and where the federal government, charged constitutionally with protecting the rights of citizens, stood by, did nothing, observed, took notes. And there was, and so as I was preparing my report, there was this moment where I was writing this about the role of the federal government and coming to the conclusion that this was the key to the story. And I was teaching constitutional law in my classes at Spelman College. And so I knew fairly well that the Constitution was being violated, that after all, the 14th Amendment was intended to give the federal government power over what the states could do in racial matters and to protect citizens against racial discrimination and to put the federal government behind them in that protection. So I knew that something was constitutionally wrong, and I did some research and found that in fact there was a statute, section 242, title 18 of the U.S. Code, which made it a crime for any official to violate constitutional rights, and made it a federal crime. And therefore the federal government should have been apprehending the sheriff of Dougherty County and the policemen of Albany, and they weren't doing a thing. And as I was preparing this report, I decided just to check up on what I was saying in terms of the law and the Constitution. And I decided to call the American Civil Liberties Union in New York and just get confirmation of or denial of what I was concluding. And so I called the Civil Liberties Union in New York, and somebody answered the phone, and I said, I'd like to talk to one of your attorneys there. And he said, well, I'm one of the attorneys here. And I described the situation. I described what I was reporting, and I said, does that make sense to you? And he said, absolutely. I said, by the way, what is your name? He said, William Kunstler. Bill Kunstler was, as people later came to know, one of the important figures in the movements of the 60s, as a defense lawyer for so many people arrested in those years. In any case, I made my report. The report made the front page of the New York Times, and it also made the internal records of the FBI, because Martin Luther King was queried by the press about what he thought of the report, which was critical of the FBI and the federal government, and he said that's absolutely true. And the FBI, I learned this later from Freedom of Information requests, and that the FBI had recorded this and was a sort of an early signal to J. Edgar Hoover that King was somebody that they had to really keep an eye on, that he was a critic of the FBI, because it was the first time he had openly said something about the FBI.
And of course, the FBI then wiretapped him, surveilled him extensively,
yes,
while simultaneously not enforcing the laws of the land.
Yes. I mean, the record of the FBI in relation to the civil rights movement, was a horrendous one. And I think it's always important when sort of talking about that, not to sort of sequester the FBI, as the culprit in this, because the FBI is part of the Justice Department, and the Attorney General is in charge of the FBI. He's really J. Edgar Hoover's boss. Robert Kennedy was J. Edgar Hoover's boss. John F. Kennedy was President of the United States, and ultimately they bear the responsibility for what the FBI was doing. But I had a number of experiences with the FBI, which I wrote about, and which drew the FBI's attention to me also.
Well, what did you think about, two of the icons of the liberal imagination of that period, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and his brother, the President, Jack Kennedy? Apparently, Bobby Kennedy was wont to say that it was with great difficulty that he signed Hoover's request to wiretap Martin Luther King. What do you think about that?
Well, sure, I'm sure it was great difficulty, but he did it, and therefore he played a role in that really scurrilous attempt of the FBI to really make Martin Luther King out to the public as somebody not to be trusted. And Robert Kennedy did a number of things in those years which do not fit the image of him as a sort of champion of racial equality. Now, it may have been true that, as some people claim, those friends of him claimed, that later he changed, and later he had a better understanding of the race issue. But for a number of years there, he was really very much a collaborator. I mean, for instance, when the Freedom Riders were being beaten and in Alabama, in Birmingham, and buses were being burned, the riders are being pulled out of the buses and beaten with clubs, and the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, the Justice Department, did nothing about that. And when the Freedom Riders decided, despite all of this, the bus had just been burned in Anniston, Alabama, and a number of these people were hospitalized, but they decided, in fact, it was SNCC that decided to carry on the Freedom Ride that the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and CORE had started, and to carry it on to Jackson, Mississippi. In other words, to go ahead with the original plan, which was to go all the way to New Orleans. And they told the Justice Department, we're going on to Jackson, Mississippi. What are you going to do to protect us? And Robert Kennedy, instead of saying, okay, you have an absolute constitutional right to ride the buses together, and the federal government is going to protect you. Instead of saying that, he made a deal with the governor of Mississippi that when they arrived in Jackson, they would protect them from being beaten, but they would arrest them. That was the nice liberal compromise. And I remember also that there was that moment when a number of black civil rights people had a meeting with Robert Kennedy to try to explain to him what was going on. They left that meeting in anger because he didn't seem to get it. As I say, later on, apparently he took a trip through the South with Marion Wright Edelman, and she gave him a little education about what was going on in the South, and he apparently became, more conscious of what was happening.
Now, the Albany, Georgia example is something that might inspire people today who feel oppressed, that they're inconsequential, that there's nothing they can do to fight the power. Well, as you just suggested, not only was the federal government against the African American citizens of that part of Georgia, but the state and local governments as well, and the judicial system, which was there supposedly to protect them.
Well, Albany is an interesting instance because the Albany experience is looked upon, even by historians sympathetic to the movement, is very often looked upon as a failure. They talk about the Albany, Georgia as a sort of a failed event. And I disagree very strongly with that. They consider it a failed event because it had no immediate consequences in terms of changing the situation in Albany, Georgia. But it had enormous consequences in giving hope to the black people of Albany and showing them that they could resist and survive. And it laid the seeds for a later change in Albany, Georgia. So I think it was a very superficial view of the situation, and that happens very often. That is, that momentary defeats, or defeats that may not be overcome for several years, are simply labeled defeats without understanding that very often defeats lay the groundwork for later victories by what happens to people in the course of that struggle. And that is, I believe, what happened in Albany, Georgia. One of the SNCC people who went into Albany, an early pioneer, Charles Sherrod, was arrested. He stayed in Albany. He's there to this day in Albany, Georgia, 40 years later, organizing people, and he, when you talk to him about the Albany events, he says that was no defeat. That was a victory for the black people of Albany.
And make the connection with people today who may feel that they have no tools to fight the power.
Yeah. Well, of course, not just Albany, that the whole history of the civil rights movement is a history of people who appear to be powerless, who appear to be helpless, and who manage by perseverance, by risk-taking, by courage, who manage to organize, to speak out, to gain adherence, to win the sympathy of people, and to win support, and to finally break through and make some changes. The whole civil rights movement is an example of that. I moved into the South in 1956, and it did seem hopeless. That is, the black people of the South had no resources to defend them. The federal government was against them. The local governments were against them. They did not have the economic power. They had no political power. The police forces were all white. The state troopers were all white. It didn't look as if they had a chance. And yet, a movement began. And nobody can say when it began. You know, some people trace it to the sit-ins of '60, but you can trace it back to the Montgomery bus boycott of '55. But you can trace it even before that to invisible stirrings below the surface. There were bus boycotts before Montgomery that were not acknowledged, that were not reported. There were sit-ins before the 1960s sit-in that nobody took notice of. There were quiet actions that took place that were defeated. There were gatherings of black people in churches, on college campuses, and so on, that were preparing the way for what finally happened. And and although the forces of segregation claimed that they would never give in, and this is a common thing you see so often in history, that people who hold on to the status quo say very confidently, we will never be defeated. You know, the Ford Motor Company facing the strikers in the 1930s, the General Motors facing its striking workers in 1936-37. No, they can't beat us. We're too big, too strong. They were defeated. And this happened in the civil rights movement. I have this vivid memory of being at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965, and I was on the last leg of that march coming into Montgomery, and leaving. Finally, the march culminated in Montgomery, and I went to the airport to fly back home. In fact, I encountered there Whitney Young, who later became head of the Urban League, or maybe he was already head of the Urban League. But in any case, Whitney Young had come down at the last moment. He hadn't participated in the march, but like a lot of leaders come down at the last moment to participate in the ceremonies. And he was there in the airport, and we were sort of old colleagues from the Atlanta University system, And we sat at a table in the restaurant, black and white together, you might say. And the waitress who waited on us had this big button which said, "The White South says never." And she was serving us.
One of the things I have to say for people who can't see you is the extraordinary animation that you bring to telling this story. And I know part of that is because you were there. You talk to these people, you walk those roads, and that breathes a certain kind of life into history that, is not very common.
Well, thank you, David. But one of the things that I very often tell teachers, and I'm always telling things to teachers, one of the things I tell teachers is that I think they should never hesitate to bring their own personal experiences into the classroom. Teachers very often are shy about that. They think it's sort of unprofessional. Teach the syllabus, teach the textbook, teach the stuff that you want to teach, but don't bring your own life and your own experiences. But after all, every teacher has, maybe a teacher has not had the kind of experiences I have had, but all teachers have had certain kinds of experiences which made them what they are, and whatever those experiences are, whatever led to change in consciousness of those teachers, students should know about that. And I discovered this, that whenever I brought into the classroom my own experiences, the interest of the students suddenly quickened. I don't want to say that before I brought my experiences in, my students were asleep. I like to think that half of them were awake, but certainly when I began to bring my own life into it, my own experiences, yes, students always want to know, and a lot of teachers don't understand this. Students always want to know who their teachers are, what they really are, behind the textbook, behind the syllabus, what their lives are like, and what they went through, and what they're thinking about. And I always resented it when I was a student and I spent a semester or a year with a teacher, and at the end of the semester, at the end of the year, I didn't know where that teacher stood. I thought there was something missing there.
You can't be neutral on a moving train.
That's right.
That could be a title of a book.
That's a good idea.
Well, let me ask you a little bit more about Martin Luther King. Did you ever have an opportunity to talk to him, and also about his using civil disobedience as a tactic of resistance? He had gone to India, he had been influenced by Gandhi, and you've taken something from that tradition as well.
Well, sure, I suppose I have. Sometimes you take something directly from a mentor like Gandhi, and sometimes you come to a position and then find it reinforced by what you read and what you encounter. So very often it's hard to distinguish between those two possibilities. How much did King already have in his consciousness about the philosophy of nonviolence before he studied Gandhi? How much of it was initiated by Gandhi, how much it was reinforced by Gandhi? But certainly there's this confluence of these two important people. I knew King simply because his family was an Atlanta family, and I was teaching in Atlanta, and the black community of Atlanta was a very close-knit community, so it was inevitable that I would come into contact with King and social occasions and so on. And so
how did you find him as a man?
Very low-key. you know, it's very often true of great speakers that you encounter them, and I don't know what you expect. You expect them to break out into an oration when you say good morning, but Very often, they're very quiet, and that's the way King was. Very quiet and modest and low key and thoughtful, measured. Just a very nice person. Nothing of the charismatic leader showing in personal encounters. And we would talk about nonviolence, and I remember, the issue coming up, which always comes up. How total is your belief in? Aren't there any situations, and King would say, well, there might be. I can't. I don't want to take an absolutist position on this. People always ask, well, what if your wife was being? They always bring that up. He says, I don't know what I would do in such a situation, but I can tell you, how I feel about the specific situations that we are dealing with today. Gandhi was really similar. Gandhi was not an absolutist on the question of nonviolence, and Gandhi suggested that, who knows, there might be times when it would not be the right thing to be perfectly passive and nonviolent. But certainly in the historical situation in which Gandhi found himself, and similarly for King, they thought that nonviolence was not only a good tactic, but was philosophically defensible. And very often this is overlooked. Well, the establishment especially likes to overlook the philosophical basis for that and think of it as only as a tactic. And I think that the difference of viewpoint about that is responsible for the idea that King thought that if you were arrested, it was only right that you should go to jail and take your punishment. There's a very sort of comfortable liberal idea about civil disobedience, that it's all right to commit civil disobedience, but then you must take your punishment. And of course, very often the people who were leaders of the civil rights movement took their punishment. They went to jail. King did. Gandhi did. But it doesn't mean that they thought it was right to take your punishment, and it doesn't mean that under all circumstances they would have done the same. There might have been circumstances in which they would have refused to take their punishment, because certainly they didn't think it was right that they should be put behind bars for what they did. No, it was I think nonviolence was a deeply held belief. But I guess I should add this, that very often the phrase nonviolence is used in isolation from action, and nonviolence and pacifism too are considered to be passive reactions to injustice. But that was not the intention of King and Gandhi, and certainly you can see that in their behavior. The phrase that King used, and the phrase that SNCC used, and people in the Southern movement used, was not simply nonviolence, but nonviolent direct action. Passivity was not the answer. Action was the answer. The action would not initiate the violence. The action might bring about violence inevitably, because the forces in power might use violence against people who were nonviolent. That was understood. And that shouldn't stop people from engaging in nonviolent actions. But the point was that if you're going to make progress, you're going to have to take action against the establishment. You're going to have to resist it in some way, although you do it nonviolently.
It's interesting that Gandhi called it satyagraha, which is truth force, and he saw it as a very active motion, something moving forward rather than being acted upon.
Yes. Yes, King and Gandhi were together on that point. And
well, we're approaching the University of New Mexico campus in Albuquerque.
And David, this has seemed like a few minutes.
Tempus fugit, as they say in Sanskrit. I believe that means time flies. We have carpe diemed. We have seized
wow.
the day. I'm trying to impress you with my.
You're very erudite today.
I'm
David.
trying to impress you with my.
Interviewers usually, can barely get out a word of, just ordinary Yiddish.
Well, thanks very much to you, Howard Zinn, once again for.
It was a good ride, David.
I'm David Barsamian. Thank you very much for listening.
Called the Wellfleet Harbor Actors Theater. And, small theater that he acts, he directs, he produces, takes tickets. He lives on Cape Cod with his wife and 2 little kids. And do you know Cape Cod at all?
Never been there.
Never been there. You should come. Cynthia. You all should come.
As a group.
As a group.
Visit.
It's a wonderful place. But David knows. And, it's...
So you have two sons?
Hmm?
You have 2 sons?
It's daughter and a son.
Oh, daughter and son. And
Yeah.
you said your son-in-law, was that your son-in-law?
John Cabot Zinn.
So he took your daughter's name? Is that right? No.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
really wonderful.
Smart
guy.
Yeah, well, they hyphenated name. His name was Cabot. Her name was Zinn, so they put it together.
It's to put the Zinn at the end.
That's right.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
That's pretty cool. It's not Zinn Cabot.
Yeah, well, our daughter is
Sounds better.
Our daughter is pretty conscious feminist, and her husband obsequiously goes along.
We're now driving back to Santa Fe after Professor Zinn regaled an audience at the University of New Mexico of teachers and students. And those kinds of exchanges are very enlivening.
This is a great encounter. A lot of wonderful questions. And the questions from people who are directly engaged in teaching and who themselves are, you might say, agents of educational change and social change in what they do. And they asked a lot of very probing, interesting, important questions. So, it was very good audience in terms of men and women and Hispanic people, and I guess that's what you would expect in New Mexico. So it was a fun gathering.
And you like that kind of give and exchange, going back and forth?
I do, yeah. I actually prefer it to a kind of formal lecture, where, and you know how formal I am, David. It's more fun because when you lecture, you're responding to what you think are the questions in the audience. You're imagining what questions there might be, and presumably you've fashioned your talk to respond to that. But here you don't have to imagine. These are the questions. You are directly responding to what's on people's minds.
Let's go back, if we can pick up the thread of Gandhi and King a little bit, because here were 2 major social change figures who were never elected to any office.
Well, that tells you something, I suppose. Some of the most important figures in history have not been elected to office, and probably there's a logic to that, and that is once you're elected to office, you become a less important person in history. That is, you may become more important in the eyes of the establishment, and that you have the power to make decisions, but less important as a factor in social change, because as soon as you take office, you are being battered by all of the instruments of wealth and power, which diminish whatever moral compassion you initially brought to that office. So King didn't seek office, and needed Gandhi. And you may recall that Albert Einstein was offered the presidency of Israel when Israel was first formed, and he refused it. I think he understood that the principles that he held so strongly would in some way be blunted by entering that den of corruption which exists around every political leader.
Another figure from the 1960s who made a tremendous impact and was assassinated in 1965 was Malcolm X. What's your assessment of Malcolm X?
Well, Malcolm X is a very important figure, especially for young black people, and he was an important counter, you might say, to whatever tendencies there were in the civil rights movement to naivete. He was not going to be taken in by the black establishment or the white establishment. As I said before, in this exchange we had at the University of New Mexico, he analyzed the March on Washington as an example of a controlled movement, a movement controlled by the powers that be. So he was a fresh and vigorous voice, saying things that other people in the movement would not say. And sure, he was an angry voice and a scary voice to white people because he talked about self-defense. He did not believe in nonviolence, although there's no indication that he ever engaged in an act of violence or provoked violence, but he certainly believed in self-defense. And in fact, a number of people in the civil rights movement who were even part of what you might call a nonviolent civil rights movement did in fact believe in self-defense. And he believed in separation, and there was a certain validity to his worry that if you didn't have separation, that any integrated group would be dominated by whites, by the people with the most power and the most money. And there was, I think, value to this position, even though it wasn't an ultimate moral position. And in fact, Malcolm gave voice to this ultimate position at a certain point later in his life when he came back from Mecca. It's not long before his death, and he took a different view of racial segregation and was more open to black, white, colored interchange working together.
One of his most famous speeches is the House Negro versus the Field Negro. The House Negro he presented as someone who was kowtowing and obsequious to the white plantation owner, as it were, and the Field Negro who was rebellious, who was active, and who was seeking to break away and to free himself.
Yeah, Malcolm was great at sort of epitomizing sort of ideas in very colorful analogies and metaphors. And I remember him saying that if the master's house caught on fire, the House Negro would say, "Our house is on fire," and the Field Negro would say something like, "Great."
Let's move on to an area that you take a lot of interest in, and that is books. There's a very unreported phenomenon going on right now in terms of bestsellers around the country. Books by Noam Chomsky, 9/11, Barbara Ehrenreich, Nickel and Dimed, Michael Moore, Stupid White Men, Kevin Phillips, Wealth and Democracy, Eric Schlosser, Fast Food Nation. All of these have a decidedly progressive bent, and surprisingly, they're on bestseller lists. What accounts for that?
Well, what accounts for that, I think, is that there is an underreported and unnoticed large segment of the American population which does not go along with the orthodoxy that we see at the top. That does not go along with our political leaders and does not go along with our cultural leaders in the newspaper and television industry. It indicates that there are millions of people in this country who are dissenters. And so I think it's a very healthy bit of data that we see Noam Chomsky's book 9/11 selling a couple of 100,000 copies, and Barbara Ehrenreich's book, really, it's about the class situation in this country, about poor people after the so-called welfare reform of the Clintons and the Republicans. The poor people just desperately trying to survive. As her book, Nickel and Dime, has been on the bestseller list of the Times for many, many weeks. That's, I think, a very good sign. And of course, Michael Moore's book has been up there on the bestseller list, and he's, of course, outrageously irreverent in dealing with corporate power and military power. So all of that, I think, is very hopeful sign, but it also should also be a sign to us of how this large number of dissenting Americans can be ignored, but they're there.
And publishers like Seven Stories that put out your book, Terrorism and War, and the Chomsky book, and others, literally cannot keep enough books in print. South End Press, the same thing. They're enjoying unprecedented demand for alternative information.
Yeah, I think that's a good sign, especially since these last several decades have seen a centralization of the publishing industry, with publishers merging and until we have industrial giants controlling the publishing industry. And I remember being shocked myself when I learned that my publisher of My People's History, Harper Collins, was now owned by Murdoch, and you have GE and Disney owning publishing mega enterprises. So the fact that there are independent small publishers that are managing to survive, and even, as you pointed out, grow and sell a lot of books, is a sign that despite this monopolization that's been taking place, there's a hunger out there for different voices. And you mentioned Seven Stories Press, there's South End Press, there's the New Press, and there's Beacon Press. Yes, Beacon Press is independent of corporate power. It's sort of run by the Unitarian Universalist Church, and they are open to all sorts of books. At least what we have now is books that we can point young people to and say, here's something you can read.
And talk about the value of literature and the printed word, particularly in a time where it seems that cinema has become the dominant cultural marker. For example, you ask someone, did you read The English Patient by the talented Canadian writer Michael Ondate? And they say, no, I didn't read the book, but I saw the movie. Did you read Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird? And they say, no, I didn't read the book, but I saw the movie.
Yes. I sometimes say that myself. But most of the time I do read the book before I see the movie, and almost always I'm disappointed, because if you have a really good book, movies will rarely do justice to it. There are rare exceptions. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold was a remarkable movie made out of a very, very good John le Carré book. But To answer your question more directly about the relative value of books and the visual media, obviously many more millions of people will see movies than read books. But that doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the impact, the depth of the influence. And I've often used this test to confirm my belief, hardly based on scientific inquiry. Hardly any of my beliefs are based on scientific inquiry, but to sort of, as a test of my belief that the visual media, as sensational and glamorous and mesmerizing as they can be, do not have the kind of lasting influence that books have. I use this simple test, and that is, how many people have told me, I read this book and it changed my life? Many people have told me that about various books. Nobody has ever said that to me about a film. I've never heard anybody say about a film, this film changed my life. So that also is sobering for me, who is interested in movies and who would actually like to see movies made of things that I've written. But it sobers me when I'm at first captivated by the thought, oh my God, maybe the people's history can be put on screen and be seen by 10 million people instead of being read by 1 million people. And I think then, yes, 10 million people is a larger number than 1 million. You may have noticed that my mathematics is of a higher sort. And but I'm dubious that if people's history were put on screen, it would have as important an effect on viewers as the book has had on readers.
Books are read and reread and referred to and underlined.
Yes, you go back to a book and you play with a book and you sit and stand and sleep with a book. And you can rewind the book very easily.
And you say that books are still the freest area of inquiry. What do you mean by that?
Well, despite the fact that the publishing industry has become so much dominated by sort of multinational giants, there's still more leeway for writing unorthodox books, and even books that are published by commercial publishers, because even commercial publishers are interested in money. And if they think Michael Moore's book will make money, well, then HarperCollins will publish it, as they have. And they have made money. And so it's a trade-off, they're willing to give Michael Moore his moment, so long as they can reap the profits. And I think that leading on people to books is a very, very good idea, and otherwise they are really enslaved by television or Time, Newsweek, their local newspaper.
Well, another part of the unreported resistance that's going on right now is the enormous demands made on people like you and Noam Chomsky and Michael Parenti and Angela Davis to give public talks, and then there are these huge crowds that turn out.
Yeah, I think certainly that's a good sign. That Michael Moore may draw 5,000 people. I've heard that David Barsamian will draw 1,000 people, which is really shocking to me.
That cannot be confirmed.
and very few of my statements can be confirmed. And many of them are confirmed by David Barsamian, and how accurate can you assume that will be? But no one, the fact that thousands of people will turn out, Noam Chomsky, I will talk in one of the Santas, Santa Cruz, and 2,000 people will show up. And the fact that we get these packed audiences means, I think, that all over the country, and this happens in, not in major cities, this happens very often in small towns, that all over the country, I believe there are people who are hungry for information that they don't get in the traditional sources.
You mentioned A People's History of the United States. It was initially under contract by Rupert Murdoch's news corporation, Fox, but then the option was lapsed, and now it's at HBO, which is actually controlled by AOL Time Warner. What's the status of the TV? Explain what it is, the project.
Well, the project, which Fox first undertook and then dropped, not to my surprise, project was to take episodes out of A People's History of the United States and dramatize them in full-length feature films.
For television.
For television, yes. Fox toyed with it for a while, and the four of us were going to be executive producers, Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Chris Moore, myself, and we deliberately set ourselves up that way so we could have some control over what was being done. But Fox dropped it. HBO took it up, and we actually were glad that HBO took it up, even though HBO, as you point out, has its ultimate boss as AOL Time Warner. Because HBO seems to be freer than other networks, and probably because it has no commercials, it has no advertisers to deal with. That seems bolder. And so at this point, HBO has commissioned two writers whom we chose, the executive producers chose, writers to write films based on two episodes in the book. And so we have a writer writing a script on the Columbus Las Casas story, and we have another writer writing a book on the American Revolution, an irreverent look at the American Revolution. And those scripts are being written, and if HBO likes the scripts, well, they'll be turned into movies. If HBO doesn't like the scripts, they'll be turned into yes. Yes.
Well, there's a HBO series that is enormously popular all over the United States. It's called The Sopranos, and in an episode, I've heard that the mobster's son is seen reading a certain book by a certain historian. Can you, as they say, shine light on that, Professor Zinn?
That's
it's very dark in here.
Yeah, it's usually dark where you and I get together, David, and if I don't shine light on it, who will? So I can shine a little light on that, but and this is secondhand information, like most of the information I have. I'm told by somebody who saw a preview of the first episodes of The Sopranos for this fall series, that in the third episode, the Tony Soprano's son, who is in school, I guess. I don't know whether he's in high school or college, but he's in school, and he's in the kitchen, and he has before him a copy of A People's History of the United States, and he is confronted by Tony Soprano, and I think also by Tony Soprano's wife, and who because he apparently is telling them that he's been reading his school book, A People's History, and it tells him that Columbus is a different kind of guy than he thought, that Columbus murdered and kidnapped and tortured Indians. His father, Tony Soprano, who is not the most enlightened person in the world, goes into kind of minor rage, and there's there are a few moments of conflict between the son and his parents, and the son says, "Oh, look, this is what my teacher says, and this is what my book says." And Tony Soprano says, "I don't care what your teacher says. I don't care what your book says," because Tony Soprano doesn't care what anybody says. He has the power, right? He says, "To me, Columbus will always be a hero." I think that's they tell me that's the end of the episode.
There's such a thing as product placement where corporations pay huge amounts of money to have their products used by Matt Damon, so you'll see Matt Damon drinking a Coke or driving a Ford Impala or something.
I paid a lot of money for that, in that little episode in Soprano. My wife had to pawn all her clothes. We had to, mortgage our house. It was tough, but it was worth it.
Well, let's talk about another movie. That is the Godfather, and I often refer to the opening scene of The Godfather as a kind of metaphor of how U.S. foreign policy works. If you remember the opening scene, the supplicant comes to the Don, who's played by Marlon Brando, and wants to be his friend, and Brando kind of lays out the terms of friendship, and then the supplicant agrees to obey the Godfather, and Brando kisses him on both cheeks in the Italian fashion, and it seems to me that might not that be a good way to explain how U.S. foreign policy might work? That if you play along with the Don, you're honored, you're celebrated, you're protected, you're loved. And if you step out of line, like they say on The Sopranos, forget about it.
David, you have a capacity for seeing profound messages.
Where no such messages exist.
Well, I feel that there's a lot of deception and self-deception in the arts, practiced by people who are so anxious to see something sensible said in the arts, and it's and it may be that of the 20 million people who saw The Sopranos, there are 200 people, and you were among that chosen few, who said, "Oh, this is wonderful. This exposes American foreign policy." And then there are the millions who say, "Well, that's the way the world operates, and you've got to just recognize that as a fact, and not much we can do about it." And I have this argument with friends of mine who love The Sopranos. And I can understand loving something that is very well done, very dramatic. And I watch The Godfather, and I admire the way The Godfather was made. There's wonderful acting, and Marlon Brando, of course, and the music, the cinematography, the exciting story. But in the end, after all of that admiration, I really worry that basically a thug and a killer, a mobster, has been humanized in such a way as to almost exonerate what he does. So I have this complicated view of The Godfather and of The Sopranos. And I will still watch The Sopranos for the sheer fun of it, but I will have this little voice inside me saying, beware.
One of the magnificent artistic accomplishments of the 20th century is Orson Welles' film Citizen Kane, which was loosely modeled on the life of William Randolph Hearst, a notorious newspaper baron. What did you think of Citizen Kane? Did you see it when it first came out?
if I confessed that I saw it when it first came out, this would make me 120 years old, right? I know I saw it a long time ago. So it probably was when it first came out, and I've seen it since then. And of course, it's a very powerful and arresting movie, and all the ideologues of cinema, all the people who love to analyze cinema point to all the innovations, the camera work and so on, and all of that is true. And I learned about Hearst long before I saw Citizen Kane. I read a book by Ferdinand Lundberg called Imperial Hearst. You can imagine what his point of view was. And Hearst, and when I was learning about the Spanish-American War, and I learned about Hearst's role in beefing up public opinion to support war. Hearst was always, to me, one of the evil men. So, in that sense, a film that's based somewhat on Hearst, and in which people understood was based on Hearst, is, I suppose, a socially useful film. Again, there's always a problem when you take an important idea and turn it into a work of art. There's always a problem as to whether the ultimate product fulfills your initial aim. Now, I'm not sure what the initial aim was of Orson Welles, although I suspect, since Orson Welles was a political person, was a person with ideas, that he had an ideological aim. What the effect of Citizen Kane was on the millions of people who saw it, the truth is I don't know. But I don't immediately jump into the chorus that says, the greatest film of all time. It was a good film.
Well, let's talk a
I
little.
don't know, David, what do you think of it?
I think it's a masterwork of cinematography and art,
Yes.
and innovative for its time. I mean, even today, if you look at the camera angles, the cuts, the edits, it's a tremendous work.
Okay.
I'm very impressed with
All right.
Orson Welles.
Okay. I grant you that.
Thanks.
I grant you that.
Well, let's go to just two more questions, and we'll stick with literature, books. 1984, Orwell. A lot of people today are making some comparisons with what they see going on politically around the country with Orwell's 1984, where there is a permanent war going on in the background, that the citizens of Oceania don't even know who's fighting where anymore, and that there's an enormous government security apparatus. Big Brother is watching, and the Ministry of Truth has a memory hole where inconvenient facts are, dropped down, and the Ministry of Truth has on its side in this white pyramidal shaped building the slogans of the party: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. What kind of parallels do you see between the current situation with the war on terrorism and that kind of totalitarian landscape that Orwell drew?
Orwell's 1984 is a very accurate and troubling guide to what we are seeing today, and that is the control of public opinion, the manipulation of language, the slogans that are used, the names that are given to horrible foreign policy actions. Yes, the names that are given to bombings and wars, Operation Infinite Justice is what it was called at first, and then they changed it to Operation Enduring Freedom. Where where is the freedom involved in bombing a country which has been bombed and bombed and bombed, a country of desperate, miserable, starving people? Where's the freedom involved in that? And the language, the word security, has been used again and again. All of these measures being taken to control our information, to give more powers to the FBI and the police and the security apparatus, all for security. It all presupposes that it makes Americans more secure. But how does more and more interference in your private life and in your conversations and what you say and what you do make you more secure? And how does a war make the people in this country more secure if that war, in fact, is likely to inflame terrorism in the world? And of course, what about the security of other countries? It's interesting that the term is always national security. So the word security is always bound by nationalism. It doesn't take in the security of other countries. And so when you bomb another country, you're not particularly contributing to the security of people in that country. But that isn't part of the message when the word security is used. So yes, there's an absolute Orwellian use of language here by the Bush administration. And the Bush administration is not the first, of course, to use euphemisms to cover up horrendous deeds. But it is now sort of taking it to 1984, probably farther than it has.
We're in New Mexico right now. We're driving back to Santa Fe, and as you look out on this landscape, it has a very unusual history. Perhaps even the first 9/11 was, on this soil, and it's ongoing for many Native Americans who are confined to what is called reservations, kind of Bantustans, where they're allowed to sell cheap cigarettes and alcohol and operate casinos in order to support themselves. And this state also has had an enormous connection with the military-industrial complex. The first atomic bomb was exploded here, tested here, and there's still an enormous Los Alamos Labs, which is right near Santa Fe, in the direction we're driving right now, designs weapons of mass destruction. That's what it does.
Well, David, I guess what you're calling, you're doing several things here. You're always doing several things. Well, you're bringing up the history of New Mexico, a very complicated history of New Mexico, a history which can be very, very instructive. One of the first things that people should know about the history of New Mexico is that New Mexico belonged to Mexico. There's a reason why it's called New Mexico. It belonged to Mexico, and it was taken as the spoils of war. It was taken in an aggressive war fought by the United States between 1846 and 1848, a war of conquest, and New Mexico is part of the spoils of that war. So the origins of New Mexico as an American territory and then an American state should be understood as part of the history of American expansionism and imperialism. And then, of course, New Mexico is used, as you point out, as a military base, and it's used as the place to construct the atomic bomb. And how ironic that the United States is prepared to go to war against Iraq and bomb Iraq because Iraq may have weapons of mass destruction. We are going to use weapons of mass destruction against a country because we think it may have weapons of mass destruction. The United States has more weapons of mass destruction than anyone, has used them, weapons of mass destruction, with more deadly effect than any other country in the world. and so you have this irony connected with our accusations against Saddam Hussein, who may very well indeed have weapons of mass destruction, but which pale in size and importance compared to what the United States possesses and what the United States has done with those weapons.
What about the Native Americans and their situation in the country today?
Well, yeah, it's a very complicated picture, because Native Americans, on the one hand, have been sort of marginalized and still living very often in poverty and on Indian land, on reservations. A few of them have become prosperous, and the prosperity of those few has often been pointed on as an example of how well the Indians are doing. But of course, most of them are not doing well, and and there's a kind of invisible culture inside the United States, culture which is being deprived of the great benefits that this rich country could give to them if it chose to do so. On the other hand, there is an Indian movement. There's a movement of resistance, organization of Indians who are trying to fight back, trying to educate the country about their situation, and try by organization and agitation to change their condition.
Well, I have to tell listeners that Professor Zinn now has his hands around my throat, threatening me if I don't end this interview immediately. So I can take a hint. I'm not totally ignorant. Thanks very much, Howard Zinn, for your time, as always.
Thank you, David, for driving me into this state of total exhaustion by this interview.
And on the road back to Santa Fe from